Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving straight into one of the most profound and frankly tragic transformations in human history. We're going to unpack exactly how Germany, a nation fresh out of the absolute devastation of the First World War, shifted from a brand new democracy right into the grip of a brutal totalitarian regime.
Okay, let's dive into this. How does a democratic country just turn into a dictatorship? It's a massive question and honestly, one that still haunts history today. To understand this dramatic shift from the ashes of World War I to the suffocating reality of fascism, we really have to look at the incredibly fragile, shaky foundation that this new democracy was built on.
Part 1. The Catalyst, the Fall of the Weimar Republic.
So, picture this. It's 1919. Following the Treaty of Versailles, Germany is hit with an incredibly harsh and, frankly, humiliating peace deal. We're talking about a nation stripped of 13% of its territories and a tenth of its entire population. But wait, it gets worse. They lost 75% of their iron and 26% of their coal to neighboring countries like France and Poland. On top of all that, they were slapped with a war guilt clause and saddled with a crushing $6 billion in war reparations. Because the newly formed Weimar Republic was the government forced to sign this awful treaty, they were almost instantly hated by their own people.
And this deep-seated hatred gave birth to a really dangerous label. The supporters of the Weimar Republic, mostly your socialists, Catholics, and Democrats, became very easy targets for conservative nationalists. They started mockingly calling them the November criminals. These politicians and everyday citizens were basically forced to carry the burden of the national humiliation and all the sins of the old empire. They became the ultimate scapegoats in a highly volatile political climate.
But the Weimar Republic wasn't just unpopular, it was structurally doomed from day one. It had these severe constitutional defects. On one hand, you had proportional representation. Now, this sounds fair, meaning every political party got seats matching their vote share exactly. But in reality, it meant achieving a majority was virtually impossible. It just led to these fractured, incredibly unstable coalition governments that couldn't agree on anything. On the other hand, you had Article 48. This was a loophole allowing the president to declare emergencies, suspend civil rights, and just rule by decree. These two fatal flaws basically made democratic governance impossible, and it completely destroyed the public's faith in democracy. It literally left the door wide open for a dictator.
Part 2. The Breaking Point, Hyperinflation and the Great Depression.
By 1923, things went from bad to an absolute nightmare. When Germany couldn't keep up with its reparation payments, French and Belgian troops just marched in and occupied the Ruhr region, which was Germany's industrial heartland. So the German government told its workers to go on strike. And to pay them, they just started recklessly printing paper money. I mean, printing it like crazy. This completely flooded the market and absolutely destroyed the value of the German currency.
And this brilliantly, well, terribly illustrates just how absurd it got. By August 1923, it took over 4.6 million German marks to equal just one single US dollar. And by December, that number was in the trillions. Prices soared so fast that people literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to go buy a loaf of bread. This hyperinflation completely wiped out the life savings of the middle class overnight. It created this deep, terrifying national anxiety.
Then just as Germany kind of starts to catch its breath using some short-term loans from the US, bam! The 1929 Wall Street crash hits, the Great Depression begins, and all that financial support is instantly yanked away. The economic devastation was unprecedented. You had homeless men queuing just for a night's shelter, and unemployed people literally paying to sleep leaning on ropes because they had nothing else. By 1932, a staggering 6 million Germans were unemployed, factories were shuttered, there was just total crushing despair on the streets.
Part 3. The False Savior, the Rise of Hitler.
So the crucial point here is that you have this incredibly toxic mix, deep national humiliation from the treaty, plus the crushing economic desperation of the Great Depression. This is exactly what paved the way for a radical alternative. You see, Hitler wasn't some inevitable force of nature. He was a master opportunist. To a nation completely broken by unemployment, he confidently stepped up and promised jobs. He promised a prosperous future. His party masterfully used propaganda, massive, highly organized rallies, and powerful visual symbols like the swastika to project this sense of iron unity. He presented himself as a savior, a messiah for a desperate people. Capitalizing on all this misery, his party gained 32% of the vote, which ultimately led to Hitler being handed the chancellorship in 1933.
Part 4. The Horrific Reality, Nazi Ideology and Society.
Once in absolute power, the Nazis aggressively implemented their terrifying worldview.
At the very center of this was a strict, brutal racial hierarchy. They decided that blonde, blue-eyed, Nordic German Aryans were the supreme, superior race. Meanwhile, Jews were placed at the absolute lowest rung, labeled as the archenemy. They completely twisted Charles Darwin's theories to falsely claim that only the purest and strongest race had the right to survive. And this obsession with purity completely dictated society. For women, it meant all equality was stripped away. They were strictly told to stay home, run the household, and just produce pure Aryan children. The state even gave out an honor cross, bronze, silver, or gold medals, based on how many kids a woman had. But if a woman had any contact with anyone deemed undesirable, she was publicly humiliated and severely punished.
Now, what's really interesting, and honestly chilling about this slide, is how it unpacks their exact justification for war. Hitler wrote, "The primary right of this world is the right to life, so far as one possesses the strength for this." This is the core of their concept of Lebensraum, or living space. The Nazis believed that to survive and expand their master race, they simply needed more land. So they used this twisted logic to justify violent territorial expansion. They convinced themselves that invading weaker nations and stealing their resources wasn't a crime. They saw it as a literal law of nature.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because this horrifying ideology was forced onto everyone, especially children. The brainwashing of the youth was absolute. I mean, they completely rewrote school textbooks. They introduced a completely fabricated subject called racial science just to legitimize their hate. Kids were rigorously taught from day one to hate Jews and to blindly worship Hitler. Even sports were weaponized. Hitler loved boxing because he thought it would make young boys aggressive and iron-hearted. And to hide the true evil of what they were doing to undesirables, the regime tightly controlled language. They never used the word murder. Instead, they used these incredibly creepy, sanitized euphemisms like evacuation, special treatment, or the final solution.
Of course, this crusade of aggressive expansionism and racial purity had a catastrophic culmination, the Second World War. Millions upon millions of innocent lives were lost in the Holocaust and on battlefields all over the globe. But ultimately, the war ended with the total defeat of the Axis powers. By 1945, as Allied troops were literally closing in on Berlin, Hitler committed suicide, bringing a bloody, fiery end to his dictatorial regime, as you can see captured here in these Indian newspaper headlines from the time. Which brings us to our final, lingering thought for this explainer. During this era of just unimaginable brutality, Mahatma Gandhi famously wrote a letter directly to Hitler. Gandhi's core message was that the quiet, organized power of nonviolence could actually stand up to even the most powerful, violent forces on Earth. It leaves us with a really profound question. How do we best stand against tyranny when it arises? Think about the fragile nature of the democracy we looked at today. Think about how quickly constitutional flaws and economic despair can be exploited by opportunists to completely dismantle freedom. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and remember to always keep questioning the history around you.